Hello, everyone. Apologies for not being there in person. I'm feeling under the weather today, and so I thought it best to stay away. I suspect it's not COVID. It's probably just a cold or something, but it's really got me under the weather. And I'll record this, and you should see it posted. Here's where we're at for our for today and our upcoming week. The quiz is due tonight before midnight. For Monday, I'd like you to read The State of the Salmonids, which is a file that was produced by UC Davis and California Fish and Wildlife Department. And it's a really beautiful publication that talks about species status for the salmonids in California and basically gives species accounts and status updates for all the salmonids in the state. It's really beautiful. It's really kind of fun to check out the accounts as well. So please peruse that before Monday when we hope to have Jacob Katz here. I don't know what'll happen to Jake in between now and Monday with the giant storm rolling in, but I suspect he'll survive and paddle into UC Davis if he needs to. So I'm looking forward to that, and I'm looking forward to, we should be in person as well. Your final papers are going to be due next week on Friday. So as of today, you have a week to complete them and submit them. Pewter Creek is our celebration following the papers. And we want everybody who's in the lab to join us for that. It's part of a required attendance for lab members. For lecture members, it's not required, but it does serve as extra credit points if you sign up on a sheet that we'll have down by the creek. And I want to encourage you to come because it's a really fun day and it's really informative and it gives life to all the stuff that we've been talking about this quarter. And then finally, a midterm. We have a midterm due, not next week, but the week after on Wednesday, and that'll be a take-home midterm. You'll have all afternoon to do it until midnight, and it's the only midterm we have before the final after the end of the quarter. So today we're going to talk about the protocanthopterygians, which include the pike, the salmon, and also the smelts. The pikes, here is a, let's see if I can't get my pointer up so that you can see what I'm talking about. There we go. So this is a northern pike here. That's an important member of the Isociforms. The pike order, and here we have this is like a chum salmon or a dog salmon. That's a Salmoniformes, and then down here we have a delta smelt from the order Osmeriformes. So I want to just briefly go through them. Most of the lecture today is going to be about the Salmonidae, the Salmoniformes, and the Salmonidae. It's the same group. But I want to mention the Isociforms because they're an important species in terms of just they're important predators. And hey, Scout, hey, sorry, come here, come here, yeah, come here, come here, say hi to the people. All right, this is Scout. Oh my God, we lost her. Scout, go take it easy. Okay, that's Scout. Dogs like to play when I talk a lot. So they're an important freshwater predator. They probably structure communities. They're a piscivorous animal, and they're giant. And so they're very much the target of sports fishing across both Europe and the US. And they tend to be a northern species. They like cold water, a northern order, I should say. All these, almost all, both the pike, the muskie, which is sort of a more southerly distribution, and the grass pickerel, all kind of prefer cold waters, and their distribution tends to be up in North America and Europe. And they're all, especially the pike and the muskies, are the source of an important sports fishery. So the pike up here, the northern pike, is kind of the most characteristic, well-known species. The muskie are also quite well known. The pike tend to be more northerly. The muskies have a more intermediate distribution. They're found kind of from the Midwest, I guess, as south as Virginia. And then the grass pickerel are a lot like the two others. They have the same kind of fusiform body plan. They have the elongate snout, but they're just not as big. And of course, these are the animals, the pike are the animals that we use to kind of characterize the fusiform body plan, right? That elongate body, sort of ambush predator. They have the posterior anal and caudal fins, anal and dorsal fins located near the caudal fin, which give them a lot of propulsive power when they decide to move. And they have that long fusiform body, which helps to minimize drag during burst speeds and allows them to kind of coil up into a sinuous or S curve and then release and ambush whatever they're targeting for prey. And so they're all pretty intense piscivores, with the exception of the mud minnows. And mud minnows are it's interesting that they're grouped with this. These are very small. They're not piscivorous, and apparently they're associated with wetland, bog-like, low oxygen environments, but not like a southerly species like the catfish or even the Sacramento blackfish. They tend to be more northerly in their distribution, so cold water bogs and marshes, mostly on the east of the Rocky Mountains and up in Canada. So here's a few pictures of some northern pike. And I just wanted to, I think my face might be in the way, so I'm going to move it. I don't know if that helps you on your end. But this is actually Andrew Ripple catching a northern pike in Scotland and looking very excited to have added that to his bucket list. You can see the distribution of the species across the northern part of North America and also Europe. And I just wanted to kind of compare the body plan with species that we've seen before. So this is the bowfin, and this is an alligator gar, and you can see they all have the same kind of elongate body plan. But these are teleostean fishes, and so the chief characteristic difference is that they don't have a whole lot of heavy armored plating around the head. And they've got this sort of elaborate mouth structure that allows them to not only grasp prey, but to suction feed to pull them in. And certainly you can see the jaws in this alligator gar are very much different. And they look like an alligator or a tetrapod jaws. And so I just put those up to kind of highlight the similarities in the body plan, as well as the differences in structure that make this a more derived teleostean fish, as it were. Pike normally don't belong in California. As I said, they're a northerly species, but they get around. Fishers often move them places where they don't belong, because they either come from the region and it's sort of part of their tradition, and so they bring desirable game fishes with them. Or that tends to be the reason that fish get transplanted places, is by enthusiastic fishermen. And so there's a lake up in, I believe it's off the Feather River in Northern California, Lake Davis. It's not the town of Davis, it's up the Yuba River, but it's connected to the Feather River, which in turn is connected to the Sacramento River and the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. So it's connected to the state as a whole. And so pike got put in there, and the fear was that they would at some point escape. and at least some larvae would spill over and find their way downstream. And this would be considered a disaster to all of our native fishes, to our salmon runs. We'd be introducing this giant predator into our waters. And so it was decided to eradicate them. Typically, fish managers use something called rotenone to kill fish. It's targeted. I believe it works on the gill structure in a specific way. So it tends to target fishes without being toxic to humans. But it was the source of controversy because there's a town there. The town relies both upon their, they rely upon the water that they get from Lake Davis, and they also they rely a lot on the sports fishing as a source of money for their economy. And so I think they have a pretty great trout fishery as well. So I think people were mostly on board with getting rid of the pike, although that was a targeted species. But at the same time, there was a lot of hesitation because it was changing the nature of their local ecology and the economy. And also they're going to be poisoning the lake that they're drinking from. So they managed to get some buy-in, and they went and they poisoned it, and it didn't work. Either they didn't get all the fish, or somebody just went back and reintroduced them. But after this big effort that didn't quite have enough public buy-in to make it less than controversial, they tried again. And this time they got a lot of stakeholder involvement. They discussed it with the city. They heard their concerns. They talked about the dangers of pike to the overall system, and they did another eradication that worked. And at the time, they made a big to-do of it. So they here you can see they're burning a pike in effigy to try to rally people around the idea that this is a good thing and that they're improving conditions on the lake. And since then, this is, I think, in 2007, since then, there have been no pike that have been seen. But this kind of highlights the concerns about invasive species. In California, as we'll find out, there are many, many, many introduced species. And there are some species that are introduced that are extremely aggressive in terms of spreading and their impact on the ecosystem. And we call those invasive species that have the potential to sort of alter the ecosystem irreversibly. And pike is perceived to be one of those fishes. So for now, we don't have pike. I don't know how long it'll take for them to actually get here. It might be a case of sooner or later, but we'll see. So that's all I really want to say about the sosiforms, and I want to talk about the salmoniformes for the rest of the talk. This is a particularly beautiful cold water or family of cold water fishes. They're extremely colorful and charismatic, and entire cultures have been built around them as a source of food, as a totemic species that have defined a culture, that have like spiritual and cultural and artistic influence on them. And so I'll spend a bit of time. This is a very important California and really Western North America species. So there's about 10 different genera, and there are about 217 different species, depending on how you count. They have the typical fusiform body. They can be identified. They have very forked tails as opposed to like a triangular tail. And they have, and this is somewhat indicative, the adipose fin, shared only with the siluriforms, the catfish, right? The pelvic fins tend to be very far back towards the end of the body, that is towards the posterior end. And they're did I say pectoral? I meant pelvic. The pelvic fins are very posterior, close to the anal fin. And the pectoral fins tend to be, rather than being high up laterally on the body, tend to be low down. This is a fish that's designed to be streamlined, to be able to navigate fast flowing waters. And so those paired appendages act as stabilizers, both in stream and in the ocean, for those that are ocean going anadromous species. They also have, and this is another diagnostic feature of a salmonid, they have this bone that sticks out kind of on the ventral side of the pelvic fins. And you can see it here. It's called the axillary process. It's just a little bone that sticks out there and forms one edge of the fin. And that's diagnostic for all the salmon. They have a single row of sharp teeth in the mouth. They have cycloid scales. And as I've said, these are cold water fishes. We'll talk more about their evolution. The typical life cycle of the salmon is a little bit unique relative to other species, and we haven't talked a lot about reproductive biology of fishes, something that we'll get to in another lecture. But I'll talk about the life cycle of the salmon and some of the key differences with other species. We'll probably elaborate on that more later. So the adults move into a almost all the salmon rely on cold, swift-moving water with clean gravel to lay their eggs in. So whether they're coming in from the ocean or whether they're coming in from a downstream reach of the river or creek that they live on, they tend to move upstream to find these sorts of habitats that provide appropriate substrate to lay their eggs. And usually the males and the females, they sort of clean out a mound of gravel using their caudal fin. They flush out any sediment and they kind of create this, it's a little bit of a mound that they actually create. And that's where the female will deposit her eggs. The male will come by after she lays her eggs and release sperm. And this releases fertilized eggs down into the substrate where they'll hold, tucked in amongst the gravel. The larvae that emerge from the eggs are called alevin. And alevin are characterized by the big yolk sac that's attached to them. So they're not feeding at this point. They're still relying on nutrition from the yolk sac to grow. Once the yolk sac is absorbed, they'll become more active and wriggle up out of the gravel or up off the bottom and begin their first feeding. And that's called fry. That stage is the fry stage when they're doing their first feeding. Later on, as they develop, they'll become a slightly larger stage, the par, that become even more mobile and active. And this is the stage at which most species start to move downstream, especially if they're anadromous. And on the way downstream for the anadromous, the ocean-going species, they'll begin this process of smoltification. Actually, all the trout and salmon go through some kind of smoltification in which the body plan changes, the shape of the mouth changes a little bit relative to the size of the eye. The scales undergo some transformation. And in the case of the anadromous fishes, the gill structure changes radically, which allows them to osmoregulate in a saltwater environment after leaving a freshwater environment. And this is sort of the one-way trip out to the ocean. When they return, they don't really go through, at least I should qualify that, for most anadromous salmon that are semiparous, that is, they have one spawning opportunity and then they die. It's the end of their life cycle. They don't desmoltify, they don't reverse smolt back into a freshwater state. Their bodies just eventually degrade. For other species like steelhead that can go back and forth and are iteroparous, that is, they have multiple opportunities to spawn, they actually have osmotic, they can osmoregulate and shift how they osmoregulate in response to freshwater and seawater and then back to freshwater, which is kind of cool. And then after smolting, they become the adults and spend some time in the main stem or in the ocean or in the estuary before coming back to spawn. So salmon is a pretty diverse group. It's a very beautiful group. And I just want to cruise through some of the typical species. So is this a salmon? Well, yes, it's a Salmoniforme. It's a steelhead rainbow trout. Oncorhynchus micus. And the original range for steelhead rainbow trout, which are actually the same species, the original range occurred in the northwestern side of North America from California all the way up through Alaska and the Aleutian Islands and out to Siberia and the Kamchatka Peninsula out here. And since then, rainbow trout, steelhead have been distributed all across the world, both in wild populations and in cultured populations. And often where there's cultured populations, there becomes wild populations because they escape. So yes, the point here is that salmon and trouts are related, all in the family Salmonidae, which is part of the Salmoniformes. Is this a salmon? Yes, this is the Arctic grayling. This is yet another one of the subfamilies in Salmonidae, the Thymallinae. And these are really spectacular fishes. This is actually Jacob Katz, who's going to hopefully come on Monday. And this is when he and I and a group of people were up on the Kobuk River, just up inside the Arctic Circle, where we saw some pretty exotic northerly fishes. Arctic grayling are characterized by this really large dorsal fin, which is just really extraordinary. And sometimes it's brightly colored, depending on the species. And it's not really understood why they have why they've developed such a large dorsal fin. It might be some kind of display for breeding or something. But it is really singular. And I think this is like the one grayling that we caught on the Kobuk River. Anyway, you can see this is mostly a North American fish up here in Canada and Alaska. And then another group are the corygonids, the mountain whitefish, also the ciscos, and these are the Corygoninae, which is another one of the three major salmon groups: the Salmoninae, the Corygoninae, and the Thymallinae. And so these are mountain whitefish, which are found across northern Europe and northern North America. Around this region, this particular species, the mountain whitefish, Prosopium williamsonii, is found in a small population in California, and then up in the Pacific Northwest, it's much more common. And then I also included an example of another member of this family. This is Rob Lusardi, who is over, he's a professor over in the Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Conservation Biology. And here he's hooked a sheefish. This is also on a trip that me and Jacob Katz and Rob all went on up into the Kobuk River. And sheefish are a member of this family. Sheefish are extraordinarily impressive fish. They only live in a few northerly rivers in Alaska and Siberia. The Amur River, the Kobuk River, and the Noatak River, I think, are their primary distribution. And these are like meter-long plus fishes that were going in a late summer spawning migration upstream from the estuary of the Kobuk River in the Bering Sea. And these were beautiful, fast traveling fishes that schooled in these giant clusters. And there would be hundreds. We passed thousands and thousands of these fishes, which we could see underneath our boats in these incredibly crystal clear water. So we saw them flying past us, and they were really kind of irritable and just twitchy because they were on this spawning migration. And so they would hit whatever lures that we threw out for them. So we got the chance to hook a lot of these fishes. Some of them were longer than the fish were longer than the participants in the group who hooked them. And we ate a few too. And in true salmon form, they were extraordinarily tasty. That was kind of an amazing trip because of the communities of fish we could see. Underneath the rafts in the clear water, we saw dog salmon, we saw giant suckers, catastomids underneath the boats, and then we saw these massive schools of thousands of sheefish all migrating upstream. Kind of amazing adventure. So I want to talk a little bit about salmonid evolution. It's a fairly recent species. Our earliest known salmonid occurred between 15 and 90 million years ago. Sometime around the KT extinction, these guys emerged. And the main groups of salmonids, the Pacific salmonids, were diversified, the ones that we have today, about 6 million years ago. And 6 million years ago would have been like 30 million years ago was about the period when massive subduction sort of began slowing down on the coast of North America, and we began developing the coastline that we see today. And so I suggest that the salmonids first began diversifying into these habitats almost as soon as they were created, and began moving into them. And then about 12,000 years ago, so during that period as well, there was this is all during the Pleistocene. So this was an extreme period of cold, the Ice Age, one of the most recent ice ages. And so so 30 million years ago, the landscape that was terraformed and created essentially, and then there was an ice age that kind of held it intact. And then let's see if I have a slide here. I think I pulled out the slide. What a shame. The ice age essentially trapped a lot of rivers in this layer of ice, essentially. And as the glaciers began retreating, it opened up habitats. Rivers basically became open, and this particular species was poised to move in and take advantage of those habitats. And so these are the characteristic species. The salmonids are the ones that really typify these West Coast rivers that are sort of newly formed in geologic terms, and then newly opened up in terms of climate terms, in terms of the climate, with the recession of the most recent ice age. And it was new territory. It was not occupied by some of these older species like the catfishes that you have in the Mississippi Basin on the Atlantic coast, or like the centrarchids that you have in that same region over there. The centrarchids are the sunfishes. These were just sort of unoccupied spaces that this particular species, or this group of this order and these families, were poised to capitalize on. And that's why today the West Coast salmonids, and particularly California, is kind of an epicenter of salmonid diversity. We have groups of native trouts that are really singular. They're all closely related, and they're but they're very singular in terms of the habitats that they've become adapted to. And what happened in many cases is that these species, like for example, the little kern golden trout, which is right here, a particularly beautiful species. The little kern and also the California golden trout, they both have very short ranges. In fact, on the Kern River, which is mostly discontinuous from the San Joaquin River, the Kern River tends to spill out into and historically it did this as well, it spilled out into the Tulare Basin here, but it wasn't. During flood years, it could be contiguous with the other river systems in the San Joaquin Basin, but most of the time it was discontinuous, and these species got up there and they became isolated, and they each diverged. So there's like 3 different species that are packed in there within a few hundred miles of each other, and it's not really understood why they diversified so extremely as to become genetically so distinct to form species or subspecies, but they have. So that's just one extreme example of the kind of radiation and diversity that we've seen in the salmonids across the state. And there are many others. There's like the Eagle Lake rainbow trout. There's the coastal cutthroat trout, which are actually fairly common up to up to the Pacific Northwest. There's the bull trout, or Dolly Varden, which was pretty much isolated to the McCloud River, which is a tributary of the Shasta, which, as I mentioned earlier in the quarter, the bull trout is extinct in California now, in part because of its narrow range and anthropogenic changes, in particular, a giant dam that was put in its way. So I want to talk about some of our main trout species and their stories, starting with the Lahontan cutthroat trout. Now, cutthroat trout are kind of the main trout species that are found throughout the West, outside of California in particular. People go cutthroat trout fishing all across the West on different river systems. And often they're, especially in the arid West and Southwest, cutthroat trout are isolated by in river systems that are attached to lakes, right? So they will spawn up these river systems, and then the fry and alevin will go down. Excuse me, the fry will migrate downstream, and then they'll grow up in the lake itself, and then move back up to spawn. And so these populations have become isolated again with this is the whole basin and range area. And so as that area has become more arid following the ice age, these pockets, these regions have become more and more arid and more isolated. And two things have emerged from that. One is that these fishes, especially the cutthroats, have become very adaptable. The ones that have survived have been able to withstand some extreme conditions of cold and heat, and they've also become isolated. So they've developed these really even though they're all cutthroat trout, they've developed these sort of characteristic subspecies. So one of the main ones that we have here in California is the Lahontan cutthroat trout. That's Oncorhynchus clarkii henshawii. So this is the genus name, Oncorhynchus. Clarkii is the species name, and henshawi is the subspecies. So many of these trout aren't actually individual species, they're subspecies. So they have the characteristics. One way to think about it is the characteristics of an emergent species. And they've developed that genetic differentiation based upon the isolation that I was just talking about. So the Lahontan, one of the largest subspecies, capable of weighing almost 20 pounds. And you can, so cutthroats have a kind of characteristic coloration. They vary a little bit with like lake dwelling fishes between fishes that are in the streams, which tend to be a little brighter and silverier, but when they get into the lake or open waters, they tend to kind of get this pale gold or silver color. And then they have these pink hues along the sides and particularly around the cheeks here on the operculum, which is where they get the name the cutthroat, because maybe it looks like somehow they got scraped or cut there. And all the cutthroat tend to have this kind of a reddish hue on their cheeks, and to a lesser degree on the flanks as well. Although they're distinct, they're mostly distinct because of their isolation, right? So they're closely related to other cutthroats, and as a result, they can interbreed with coyote cutthroat, red band, rainbow trout, and so it makes them vulnerable to hybridization, which is a problem if those species get introduced, because it essentially creates a kind of outbreeding depression, or essentially it waters down the genetics of these species that make them distinct. And so in a sense, it's diluting their genome out of existence by having the opportunity to hybridize. The Lahontan exist only in about 5 or less than 5% of their original stream habitat, and even like less than 1% of their original lake habitat in California. And so the only self-sustaining populations in the state are in these isolated headwater streams with only a few hundred fish each. And possibly the Truckee River up by Tahoe has some more. And these fish, these were once the dominant fishes, and certainly the dominant sports fishery in Lake Tahoe. And following the introduction of lake trout, which is a Western species not found in California, they've become more and more scarce, to the point where they've been extirpated from Lake Tahoe. We'll talk about that in just a minute. There's been a lot of discussion about how to restore their populations, and one of the key things that always comes up are alien species removals, because they don't seem to compete well with other species like lake trout. And of course, reintroduction programs, hatcheries to promote genetic diversity, and then reconnecting habitats. And there's problems, opportunities, and perils with all of these. Oftentimes, fishes that we put into hatcheries tend not to get increased genetic diversity. On the contrary, they often lose genetic diversity and become sort of a pet fish. They become domesticated. Just certainly happened to some other fish stocks like fall run. Chinook salmon is very much a domesticated species. And also it's a function of habitat, because these fishes require cold water streams, the headwater streams with deep forests, old growth forests that keep them cool with lots of riparian vegetation are really important to them. You can find more information if you go to this YouTube video, if you're interested, check it out. So, as I said, Lake Tahoe was one of the prime habitats for Lahontan cutthroat, and this is not a Lahontan cutthroat. This is an introduced lake trout, and that's a really incredibly ugly lake trout. I mean, they actually are beautiful fishes, but that thing's just kind of a pig. I guess we put it in here for contrast because here's what people used to catch. They used to catch these are all Lahontan cutthroat from the olden days, and one of the issues was the introduction of lake trout, but not just lake trout. There's been a series of introductions, and they've really altered the ecology of Lake Tahoe. So, as I said, sports fishers often not educated about the impacts of introducing their favorite species to their favorite body of water, and so since the 1800s. We've had rainbow trout, Brooks brown trout from Europe, and then lake trout introduced. But it was really, the lake trout got really established in the early 20th century. And then crayfish were introduced as well. I'm not sure if they had direct impact, but by the late 1930s, the Lahontan cutthroat were gone. And so the lake is now dominated by lake trout. It's also dominated by kokanee salmon. Kokanee salmon are sockeye salmon, which is a Pacific Northwest species that was intentionally introduced and is still introduced and maintained by California Fish and Wildlife as a sports fish. They're an ocean-going fish, and so by kokanee, we indicate that this ocean-going fish is essentially landlocked. It uses the lake as its ocean, where it lives out the adult form of its life cycle before going back up into the small tributaries around Tahoe and spawning. And then more changes came, while I'm on the topic, more changes came to Tahoe when somebody introduced mysid shrimps as a good idea to be able to restore native populations by providing a food source, and also in an effort to clear the water. But it had an unintended consequence. It actually, the mysid shrimp suppressed the native zooplankton that lived there, essentially by feeding aggressively on them. And because the population of native zooplankton decreased, algae started to proliferate. And so the lake began to go from being this beautiful blue color to this sort of green, turbid water. And other native fishes, the red-side shiner and speckled dace, have notably declined during that period of introduction for the mysid shrimp. And on the contrary, mysid shrimp really do support lake trout, which feed on them. But in general, the mysid shrimp have been just a bust. So it was an intentional introduction to try to rebalance the lake. And it had sort of disastrous consequences in terms of water quality. And it doesn't even provide a really good food source, because they're sensitive to light, so in the daytime they migrate down to depth, which is when most visual predators are feeding, and so they're not even really a particularly good food source for the fishes that do remain, because they're way down deep and they come up at night. Since then, the lake has continued to change, and this is a little bit off topic, but might as well just go all the way since I'm talking about Lake Tahoe. Largemouth bass have been introduced, bluegill have been introduced. These are warm water species, but in the late 20th century, they managed to become established. And because of other changes, invasive plants have become established, and Asian clams, which are a very intense filter feeder, have invaded and covered the bottom. So now we have like an environment that's full of like really a lot of non-native fishes, and the invertebrate community is completely changed. And we have this introduced clam that covers the bottom, and there's crayfish. Anyway, Tahoe has really shifted. It's a Keep Tahoe Blue. You've seen the bumper stickers. This is all part of the effort to understand why Tahoe struggles to stay blue, and what's happened to the ecosystem is a big part of that equation. So moving on from Lahontan, rainbow trout, Oncorhynchus micus, O-micus. It's kind of a weedy fish. It turns out that this is California's payback for all the introduced species that have come here to live. This fish is amazingly physiologically tolerant, and has spread all around the world. As you can see in this map, the black stipples are its native range, and the red is showing where it invaded. It just seems to be like a really dominant fish. It's easy to culture, gets along well with most other species, and yeah, it's pretty much everywhere in the world. Steelhead rainbow trout spend about 1 to 3 years in freshwater, and then if they're steelhead, they go back out into the saltwater, and so they spend 3 or 4 years out there, and they're iteroparous, so they can migrate back up into streams and spawn and then go back out again. So they have a very complex life history, and there's a lot of confusion about this, but steelhead and rainbow trout are the same species, and the populations are linked. And emerging evidence that's come out of UC Davis, I think from Mike Miller's lab over in animal science, is that there's really a single gene that is responsible for anadromy. And so when that gene flips on for certain populations or certain conditions, you can get an increased number of rainbow trout that begin to migrate out into the ocean. If ocean conditions support it, or rather if in-river conditions aren't supporting their population. Likewise, if your in-river conditions are fine, then that gene tends to flip, and that promotes staying within the river. And there's a couple of videos here that you can watch to learn more about that if you'd like. But this is an interesting thing because steelhead are actually listed on some state and federal agencies as being threatened, whereas rainbow trout are kind of everywhere. So the irony here is that this very weedy species that's moved all around the world can have an ocean-going version of it that's threatened. And I think people are still trying to parse out that difference. Rainbow trout in California, there's about 15 different types of them. There's the 8 different steelhead distinct population segments, which is kind of like subspecies. It's kind of a slice of subspecies. There is the California golden trout, which is the state freshwater species, the little kern golden, Eagle Lake, Kern River rainbows, McCloud red bands, and the coastal rainbow trout, which is probably the trout that is the version that is most widely distributed across the planet. As I mentioned before, rainbow trout have basically been domesticated, and they're one of the few that can be considered fully domesticated. So they're kind of like milkfish, they're kind of like catfish, some tilapia species that have been domesticated for many years. In the case of tilapia, it's been thousands of years. But rainbow trout have readily taken to being domesticated. And so they're raised in hatcheries, and often they're bred for really weird traits. So this is not a natural occurring California golden trout. This is a golden trout that was bred, hybridized. Actually, not hybridized. It was essentially inbred and selected for this intense yellow color. And apparently, it's released in some creeks or streams in some places, but it's strictly a hatchery phenomenon. And so, what is it? this is their habitat of these rainbow trout. It's basically concrete pits, concrete pools. They eat pellets. People can feed them. They don't develop with any kind of predator avoidance behavior. And so these are fish that when released are very much domesticated animals living in a wild environment, and they've come to rely on, there's certain stocks have come to rely on a hatchery to maintain them. And this is one of the problems with hatcheries, is that they create a kind of reliance. They create a homogeneous, a genetically homogeneous group of fishes that rely on hatchery conditions, and they lose the heterogeneity, which has really come to define salmon. And so one of the reasons that hatcheries and rainbow trout in particular were developed is for put and take fishing. So many fish and game departments were responsible for supporting recreational fisheries, particularly back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. But it still goes on, and they plant rainbow trout in mountain lakes that didn't have any fish in them. They put them in reservoirs, which were artificial lakes, didn't have any fish in them, and so they created essentially a fishery out of it. And a lot of the hatcheries still support that. One of the issues, well, some of the issues is that some of the lakes didn't have fishes, but they had other animals, like particularly amphibians. Like the yellow-legged frog is imperiled because they're introducing these predators, and so it's imperiled other species that are non-fishy. Key California trout number 3. Wild trout are strong interactors in cold water streams. So they tend to be piscivorous on smaller fishes, as well as eating invertebrates. They create a lot of diversity, and because they tend to be a top level predator, they have important interactions with smaller species like dace or even suckers and sculpin in terms of like prey availability and in terms of predator-prey interactions. Trout really structure the ecology of streams. The coastal rainbow trout. Turns out that most of the trout, the rainbow trout that have been distributed around the world, come from the McCloud River. The McCloud is a center of salmonid diversity for the world, including the California rainbow trout, which has been spread around the planet. And then it's also the source of red band trout, Central California, or Central Valley steelhead, and then 3 to 4 different runs of Chinook salmon, as well as the bull trout or the Dolly Varden. They all come from this one stretch of river, this branch off of or tributary off of the Sacramento River and the Pitt Rivers up in Northern California. This was a major source of diversity for salmon that emerged from this one site. And these are a couple shots of the McCloud River. The water there is said to be incredibly pure. There have been bottling companies that wanted to bottle the water up there and sell it and export it to other places. It has some really pristine forests surrounding it, these amazing riparian corridors, and a variety of riffles and stuff upstream that provide perfect spawning habitat in the interriffle range and perfect cold water because of its northerly location tucked up into the southern end of the Cascade Mountain Range. This was also incidentally, or maybe not incidentally, but this was the site of a really important Native American culture in California, the Winnemem Wintu, or the Middle River people. They were originally located along this spot in the lower McCloud River, above where Shasta Dam is now in Redding, California. Shasta Dam has put their native lands largely underwater. And at one time, there were 6,000 to 9,000 people living in the McCloud River Canyon because of the abundant resources that were there. They had quite a dense population that was able to live there. And for a long time, even after the European invasion of California, they were able to survive because of the remote location. There wasn't gold up there. But eventually, European and American settlers moved in and began a process of persecution and eradication. And today, there's only a few hundred to a few thousand living members of the Wintu Nation, which incidentally still does not have federal status. So apparently some kind of bureaucratic bookkeeping incident in the early part of the 20th century had removed them from the National Register of Indigenous tribes. And since then, they've been struggling to get back their status. I mention them because it's a very strong salmon culture. They are very much identified with the salmon and the annual returns of salmon. They had all 4 different runs of Chinook salmon coming up. And it's a really important central part of their culture. And since the advent of the Shasta Dam, and now efforts to raise the Shasta Dam, and which would flood the remaining section of their ancestral lands, they've been really, really locked into salmon restoration and the management of winter run salmon and the fight over whether it really makes sense to raise Shasta Dam, which, spoiler alert, it probably doesn't make sense. There's the dam, and this is the source. This is really what this is what wiped out. Well, I should say this wasn't what wiped out the Wintu people. The dam was built. It was begun in the 1940s or 50s. It's, I believe, the largest dam in California. By that time, the Wintu had been effectively removed through disease or direct attacks. But in addition to the Wintu, the dam blocked the passage of Salmonids up and down, and began the sort of decline of this epicenter of salmon diversity. So at one time, it was considered to be the greatest salmon and steelhead river in the world. And then these dams just cut it off and wiped out mainly the anadromous fish populations. And so ironically, a hatchery was set up to try to supplement the disrupted fishery. And so they put up a rainbow trout hatchery in 1877. I guess I've got my chronology there. So this is before my chronology is a little wrong because I'm a little spaced out and I'm going overtime here too, but I want to finish up, so I'm going to torture you. So smaller dams began to be put up probably in the late 1800s, early 1900s. The big dam went up and destroyed the anadromous fishes in the 1940s. The rainbow trout hatcheries were put up to supplement the fishery, and eventually those McLeod strain of rainbows were exported all around the world, which is what led to that map that I showed you having red all over the planet, because if you've caught a rainbow trout, you probably caught a McLeod rainbow, which was developed at this hatchery here and domesticated there. And there's another video if you're interested in the McLeod River. It's kind of an amazing place. I'm going to fly through this. McLeod River red band trout is another subspecies of rainbow trout, Micus stonii. It's very small fragmented population that is very isolated and in very critical condition. And the drought was really, really rough on it because it caused a lot of its the tributaries up there on the McLeod to go dry. And so people basically sent people to go up and rescue fish that were in these isolated pools, and they took them to a hatchery to try to maintain them through the drought and then re-release them. And of course, the hatchery has some perils associated with it, because you don't want to keep them in the hatchery any longer than you have to, because they start to become domesticated really, really quickly. So we'll see what happens with the latest drought. This is during the last drought, and with this new drought, let's see what the case is. And then the Dolly Varden, the bull trout, was California's first salmonid extinction. I talked about this earlier. Dolly Varden had a very isolated population up here on the McLeod River, and that population was really just undermined by the Shasta Dam and the McLeod dams together, and it just blocked their spawning migrations. And also a loss of salmon, because the salmon provided food. in two different ways. The salmon provided food by bringing essentially carbon that was derived, they feed in the ocean, and then they transport it back upriver, and they die, which supports, as they decay, it puts nutrients back into the system, which eventually supports a whole bunch of vertebrates that feed on the plant material. And so essentially the system became more depauperate in terms of basic food web organisms like insects and whatnot. And also there was a loss of juvenile salmon for bull trout to feed on directly. And so the loss of salmon had a big impact. Remember I mentioned that salmon trout can structure these freshwater streams. Well, they're very much tapped in, their survival is very much tapped into the ecological structure of the food web and their other species. Also, temperatures were warming through the period. There was a reduction and degradation of spawning habitat. And then there were introduced species like brown trout from Europe that they had a hard time competing with. The Eagle Lake rainbow trout are like an inland steelhead. So in Eagle Lake, this is an interesting phenomenon for a lot of cutthroats as well. Essentially, the Eagle Lake rainbow trout spawn up Pine Creek, and the juveniles develop up there and then go back to live in the Eagle Lake, which is their ocean, before returning. So they have essentially a steel-like life cycle, but they're a rainbow trout. And this is what I was just talking about, migrating up Pine Creek. Yeah, and that's all I have to say about that. Oh yeah, so here's the historic spawning grounds of Eagle Lake rainbows. This is Pine Creek upstream up in the mountain meadow. And there's been a lot of problems. There's been a lot of degradation due to grazing and land use and that sort of thing. And so the habitat on Pine Creek became so degraded that they weren't successfully spawning. And so they put in a hatchery. And so now there's been no natural spawning since 1959. They catch all the adults that are going up and they spawn them at Crystal Lake Hatchery. They're actually taken away. They're actually collected here, but then they're raised in a different hatchery where they raise them for a year and a half, and they return them to the lake. And so yeah, so that's what happened to the Eagle Lake. They're no longer maintained through a wild process because of landscape degradation, but they are maintained because they're an important fishery, a sports fishery. So there's enough interest and money to do this. It's a little bit of a sad story. And then the Kern River, I mentioned the Kern River is another center of endemism, just like the McCloud River. And I talked about this earlier with the Kern River rainbows, the little kern and the California golden trout. The golden trout complex, they all live within a few hundred miles, a stretch of a few hundred miles of the Kern River. And this is the golden trout. It's really kind of an extraordinary fish, really kind of luminous. These are the kind of fishes that make you want to pick up fishing just so that you can actually see them. Here's people moving golden trout because that's what fishers like to do. But Little Kern golden trout occupied 100 miles of the Little Kern River, just above a waterfall barrier. Kind of amazing. And I'm trying to wrap up here, so I'm flying through these. And then here's again the Little Kern rainbow trout, which is also found on a small section of the Kern River. All of these are very much under threat, right? Because they occurred under sort of extraordinary circumstances, and they're very much vulnerable to invasion of other species, particularly rainbow trout, brown trout. I want to stop here before I hit anadromous salmon, and I just want to mention trout. Trout essentially, while California is the heart of a lot of trout endemism and evolution, trout can be invaders as well. Brook trout is an East Coast trout that's been introduced to California. Brown trout are a European trout that's been introduced here with kind of devastating impacts at times to the native species. And then in exchange, California has the rainbow trout, that I've talked about, and rainbow trout actually. So in Europe, for example, rainbow trout is the invader, and they're trying to maintain their brown trout populations, which are very endangered in Europe because of the invader. So they have the flip problem. Our invader becomes, or the invader that they sent here becomes endangers our native species, which are doing well in Europe, and their native species are imperiled. So that came out very confused. But anyway, this concludes my lecture, and I'm sorry that I was so spaced out and that I went over time. But I'm very foggy today. Thanks for putting up with me. That's it.